Hello, is this audible? If you're what? Am I audible?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? I'm on the phone though, and I'm live.
Yeah. Oh wait, hold on.
Am I audible? Hello, am I audible? Okay, Miranda says the sound is good. Okay, good. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I hope you are having as the president advised, that you are reflecting on the meaning of President's Day, president with which has now become singular. It used to be plural. I'm delighted to be here. I've got some questions on my phone, and I'm very excited to answer them. So thank you. The first question I was asked in honor of the day is to talk a little bit about favorite and unfavorite presidents. And I guess that raises the question of how we judge or don't judge presidents. The presidents who usually get the worst rap in American history are the string of presidents before the Civil War who are blamed for failing to prevent the Civil War. While some of them did some pretty heinous things, like James Buchanan, the last pre-Civil War president who failed to guard arsenals in the southern states and allowed southern states to raid those arsenals and take federal arms. I think looking back on it historically, none of them really had the capacity to avert the war. And I think putting the blame on those figures is putting the blame in the wrong place. The office of the presidency, the national government, it just in the 1850s did not have the wherewithal to solve the problem in a way that would have headed off the crisis. I think in the same way, the presidents who get a lot of blame, the post-Reconstruction presidents, I don't know how it is imaginable that Rutherford B. Hayes and Garfield and Chester Arthur and the others could have imposed a civil rights order on the South. Ulysses Grant, the war hero, tried and basically failed. And what Grant was unable to do, I don't see how Rutherford Hayes could have done. My least favorite presidents are the string of presidents immediately after the First World War. Wilson, who was president during and after the war, Harding, and Coolidge. Because those presidents did have the ability to negotiate a proper financial and peace settlement after the war that would have prevented the Great Depression, the rise of Hitler, and the Second World War. And they really didn't. There's a tendency in the conservative world to try to rehabilitate Harding and Coolidge. I actually think that they deserve much more odium than they get. We look at them purely in domestic policy terms, but the greatest challenge, maybe one of the greatest challenges ever faced in the history of the presidency, was the challenge to come up with a settlement in 1919. The United States had almost as much power in 1919 as it did in 1946. It could have done so. It had the debts, and it didn't. So those are my least favorite string. I think of presidents who deserve more credit than they get. Probably the one who tops my list is Dwight David Eisenhower. You know, when I was raised, we look back at the 50s as boring period in which not much happened. And you have to think what an amazing achievement it was in the aftermath of World War II and the Great Depression, and with nuclear terror over people's heads, and in the beginnings of the civil rights movement, to create the sense that things were stable, under control, and boring. That was a great achievement. I think presidents just systematically don't get enough credit for the bad things they prevent. I think under Eisenhower, every day there was an opportunity for something terrible to happen, and it just didn't. And he gets the credit for all the bad things that didn't happen under his administration. Next question. If for whatever reason, this is an interesting one, another Supreme Court seat opened up, would you be okay with Trump appointing another one? Frankly, I mean, however I feel about it, I don't know what choice there is. I mean, you can imagine if there's a Democratic Senate after 2018, Democratic senators taking the Merrick Garland principle to a whole new level and saying it's not just 1 year before an election that a president can't appoint a Supreme Court judge, but now 2. But I think that spirals us into ever more dysfunction in the government of the United States. Whether you are more liberal or more conservative, President Trump's judges are probably the least abnormal thing that he is doing. And that's not a place where I have a lot of anxiety. I mean, he's obviously pretty indifferent to the judiciary. The place I worry more is about his appointment of U.S. attorneys, where he's taken on a whole new role of interrogating them. And of course, we're all worried about what's happening at the Department of Justice. Next question here. And thank you for sending in questions, and they're now coming in thick and fast. Are you optimistic that this country's political system will ever be able to overcome the intensity of the current partisanship? I don't think optimistically or pessimistically about these questions, because to ask for predictions is to imagine the future as something that already exists, that can be seen. Whereas I've become, especially in these days, ever more deeply convinced that the future is something that we make. So a lot of what I see as the intense partisanship, well, let me put it this way. So the baby boom generation, the people born between 1945 and 1960, really become the dominant force in American politics, beginning in about the middle 1990s. And we've had a long period of baby boomer dominance through their 40s, 50s, 60s. In the olden days, when people turned 65, especially men, they began to die in large numbers. But the baby boomers have greatly outlived that, and it's extended their politics longer and longer and longer. And I think a lot of what we are seeing is the long shadow of the extraordinarily lengthy political life of the baby boom generation. I think that's one of the things, by the way, that has deformed the gun debate. I mean, the gun debate is kind of the whole Woodstock generation upside down, a claim of rights with no responsibilities, no duties, no regard to others. Just, I want mine. I don't care what happens to anybody else. I wonder if, as the baby boom generation passes from the scene, which it will soon begin to do through the operations of time, whether the post-baby boom politics will look quite different. Why isn't there an official vetting process for any presidential candidate before they're allowed to enter into any primaries? For example, criminal background check, outstanding allegations, financial disclosures, and conflicts of interest, shady associations, and foreign entanglements. It seems like an excellent idea to have similar hiring criteria as you would for many less important positions. Well, we used to have that process, and it was called the party system. In the days when parties were more powerful than they are, parties would vet people, and there would be a kind of informal understanding of who can go forward and who not. Even as recently as 2012, the thing that finished off Newt Gingrich's candidacy for the Republican nomination that year was there is a kind of a discussion within the interior elite of the Republican Party that this was just not a guy who could be responsibly trusted with office. I made a joke that if there were an election for president and the franchise were confined entirely to people who had served with Newt Gingrich as Republican members of the House of Representatives, he would still lose in a landslide. But as the party system is broken down, the vetting has disappeared. Always keep in mind how much Donald Trump was a figure who conquered the Republican Party. The official party did not want him. He bested it. And by besting it, he imposed himself on it with all of his many vices. Okay. Do you agree with Jonathan Rauch's position, asks Moran Aaron, that the GOP should be boycotted? How will you vote and recommend people to vote in upcoming state elections? Of course, at the Atlantic, there is a very strict policy against taking part in partisan politics. So everything I say is subject to that there are no endorsements here. But here's how I would think about this. I understand Jonathan is one of my oldest and closest friends. We've known each other since 1979, and we've often thought a lot alike about important political issues. On this one, I think Jonathan is revealing that he lives in the greater Washington area and so is preoccupied, as I am, with federal politics. But there are a lot of states in which there are a lot of important state issues in which attitudes to President Trump don't have a lot to do with what's going on. In particular, I spend now a lot of time in the state of California. My two older children live there. And California faces a series of very difficult fiscal issues, pension issues, that need an effective conservative opposition against the prevailing liberal dominant view, which wants to settle everything by raising taxes. If I lived in a state like California, I'd be very interested to support conservative candidates who could stand up for a different approach to local affairs. Let me see here. Okay, I'm seeing a number of questions here about Paul Ryan. And one question my eye fell on it, I missed it, but there are a number of this is, do I regret voting for Mitt Romney in 2012 because of Paul Ryan's presence on the ticket and Romney's adoption of the Ryan platform? You know, I still hold to the view that Mitt Romney would have made a very, very good president. I regret that he never got the chance, and now it looks like he never will get the chance. At the time, anybody who would listen, including people on the campaign, I strongly opposed making Paul Ryan the vice presidential choice, not because of an objection to Paul Ryan as such. At that time, his character weaknesses weren't as evident as they've become since the Donald Trump election, but because it saddled the party with an impossibly radical platform. The original versions of the Ryan plan called for withdrawing the Medicare guarantee from everybody who was then under the age of 55. I mean, that was obviously, bad policy and never going to fly. So, I think Paul Ryan's influence on the party has been injurious. On the other hand, maybe had he been vice president instead of Speaker of the House, he would have done the country less harm over the past few years. Outside of DC, we hear that the Mueller investigation is leak-proof. Is that true? That is, are you hearing anything that you're not passing on to the public because such information is not confirmed? Look, I have friends who are much closer to the FBI and law enforcement than I am, and they hear nothing. That the Ken Starr legacy set a negative. Ken Starr leaked. He did briefings for reporters. He got involved. I think he was driven a little crazy by the coyote and roadrunner aspect of dealing with the Clinton presidency. And since then, not only did they change the formal regulations, but those special counsels who have gotten the job since the lapse of the independent counsel statute have generally been much more closed-mouthed. And I think that's a good thing. Remember, in the course of an investigation, a prosecutor learns a lot of things about people. And many of them are discrediting or hurtful to people's reputations without being criminal. And it should not be part of the process that if in the course of investigating a crime, the counsel finds there isn't enough evidence to prove the crime, but I find other negative things about this person, wrecking the person's reputation should not be, while not prosecuting. That's not part of the penalty. Either an indictment is brought or it's not. Let's see here. What else we got here? How would you judge the state of the Democratic Party in light of the last year? I have this feeling that the Dems will be true to their colors and screw this election up. Now, I think the next two elections are going to be much more challenging for Democrats than a lot of them assume. The economy is strong. The unemployment situation is improving. The labor force participation has been going up and wages have been rising. Now, none of this is some kind of revolution. That the first year of the Donald Trump economy does not look that different from the last 2 years of the Obama economy. But even though there hasn't been any kind of inflection point, any acceleration of the economy, these things build on each other. So, it's great when you go from 6% to 5% unemployment, and it's not better when you go from 5% to 4%. But as you go toward 4% unemployment and the economy begins to tighten, the past improvements build on each other. Jobs become that much more abundant. Raises become that much more common. Bonuses are applied, and people are appreciative. The Republican tax plan, although it's basically amounts to squeezing blue state professionals in order to reward Republican donors and red state parents. Nonetheless, there are a lot of people in swing states who are going to see benefit from it. California won't like the tax increases, but it's going to vote Democratic anyway. Meanwhile, Missouri may appreciate the tax cuts. So I think it's a real problem. The big question for the Democrats is whether to be guided to let the people who want to run for president in 2020 swing the party in the direction of the party's activist primary voters, whether it's going to follow the interests of the senatorial class of 2018, who are up for re-election in more conservative states. And I think generally a more conservative approach would serve the Democrats better, but I think it's going to be very hard for them to execute that. Oh, there's another question. Thank you. My glamorous, Mrs. Frum, here's my glamorous Vanna White off-street. What will it take for common sense gun control? I think, look, there's some things you can imagine that would be pretty easy to do. One of the things I just learned this the other day, and I was shocked at how there's no obligation on states to share all of their information with the federal government. So just in the case of protective orders, there's something like 2.1 million of those outstanding in the United States. Only about 1.4 million of them have even been reported to the federal government. And the same thing is true as mental health adjudications. So there are people with mental health adjudications against them in their state. No one's ever told the federal government to put about this person, to put them on a database. That's how that hideous Texas gunman who shot up the church and killed 26 people, how he was able to hold a gun. He'd been court-martialed for assaulting his wife and child. The military never shared that information with the Federal Register, so that databases can be made to work better. We could also do a fix where a lot of these rules, the background checks prevent people from getting new guns, but they have no impact on their ability to keep old guns. So I don't think anybody feels good if they're told that a woman's stalker can't buy any new weapon with which to kill her, but if he's already got an arsenal, that's his to keep. I think if you are on those lists, you should have to surrender all of your weapons. But I think more largely, I don't think we are naturally horrified and our attention fixed by these spectacular massacres that seem to be becoming more and more common. But there's a daily toll of accident and suicide that is a much bigger total quantity of deaths. I think one of the things I look to most, and it's not a gun control law, it's more a gun safety measure that takes place in people's hearts. A lot of people buy guns because they think they're doing right by their family. They have the weapon at hand to protect their wives and children. And they mean to do well, but they don't have training. They don't know what they're doing. And they're not always very careful. And I think if we just could convince larger numbers of people that if you're a loving father, and I'm talking about men because it's men who do this, you're a larger loving father and husband, you should not have a weapon in the house. Just don't have one in your house. I think that would go far to prevent a lot of the most terrible tragic accidents. As upsetting as these terrible massacres are, there's not a day that goes by where you don't read about one child shooting another child with a weapon that wasn't carefully guarded. And less spectacular as that is, in some ways, it's more heartrending. Why was that gun there? Why was it left where a child could find it? Is it possible to change the pathology of Second Amendment adherence? I think something like 5% of Americans, if I remember the figure right, own half the country's guns. I don't think those people are going to be changed. Some of them have political agendas. A lot of them have psychological agendas. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about the rules of the gun debate, which point to a problem here. There are all kinds of things that, because so many people own guns, because so people feel so strongly about it, because they're such a powerful group, there are certain compliments that they have to be given. We always talk about the many responsible gun owners out there. We don't have any evidence that there's so many responsible gun owners. I think there's a lot more evidence that most gun owners are nowhere near as responsible as they should be. But I don't think I can get around with it that the gun debate is driven by racial and sexual dynamics that have nothing to do with the objective necessities of self-protection. That how much of the gun debate is driven by the desire to have that men who feel decreasingly powerful in the workplace want to have in their hand an instrument that will make them feel dominant over the women in their lives. And how much of the desire to have these weapons, a sense of living in a society that's much more dangerous than it really is driven, again, by people's racial fears. It's hard to address that because that seems not very complimentary to gun owners. But, when people will not accept even a vision test before acquiring a weapon, I don't know how many compliments they deserve. What are a few books that have ultimately changed your views? A lot of my views were formed in early life. I'm probably more influenced by books than it's probably healthy. In early life, I was very formed by the books that talked about the totalitarian regimes of the middle years of the century, Nazi and communist memoirs. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago forced me to confront something that was not such a common view in the world in which I grew up, which is that while there are important differences between the Nazi and Soviet experiment and while Soviet camps were operated on different principles from Nazi camps, that ultimately that we were dealing with an evil that had a lot more in common. That was very formative. The works of Friedrich Hayek on law, not on economics, which didn't impress me so much, but his works on law made me. That's the foundation of a lot of my approach to conservatism. A lot of my reading, I was always fascinated by 18th century history, and my reading of the French and American revolutions shaped a lot of my bias toward protecting institutions and conservatism. I mean, the endless tragedy of where did the French Revolution go off the rails. I think in recent times, I have been very influenced by a lot of books about the events of the period from 1914 to 1939, and the failures of American leadership in particular that made possible the Depression and then the war. The works of people like Adam Tooze, of Barry Eichengreen, they've had a big impact on my thinking, because that was the right kind of decisions by Americans in the years between 1914 and 1930 could have saved a world of misery. The wrong decisions were made by people who are just as public spirited, just as well informed, not as well informed, they didn't have the advantage of hindsight, but just as intelligent as us, and they messed up. And the results were a global catastrophe. Thank you, Vanna. How do we get away from party extremes to get back to a moderate stance? I posted your flood zone parable looking, this is about guns, to start a middle ground, which was a discussion which was not well received by the far right. Tribalism is worrisome. What this question is referring to, I opened a piece on guns by talking about a parable about a village that had built itself in a floodplain and was constantly baffled that it was getting more floods than people who built their villages in the hills, and how all the roundabout solutions they had. I think one of the things, you will not find moderate views on social media, because what makes people go to social media to discuss politics is intense commitment. And one of the things that is, I think this is now a pretty well-known paradox, that being more informed does not make you less extreme, it makes you more extreme because it reinforces your views. I think where you see moderate views prevailing, I think it usually comes from tragic experience. I mean, there is no country on earth where extremism of any kind is regarded with revulsion, more revulsion than in Germany. And that's that people have memories. They saw where extreme politics can go. There's a wonderful music video that was made by the most popular comedian in Germany in the run-up to the 2016 election, Jan Bonnerman. He had pictures of Erdogan and Trump, and they had a line, lunatics with crazy hair, yeah, we have already been there. I mean, they've been through it. I wonder sometimes if the Trump experience isn't going to curb us, that we are going to come out of this saying, that this man has done greater or lesser, by the time he's through, greater or lesser damage to the country. And it may be very extreme damage to the country. And out of that, the analogy I keep using is like getting dozy on the highway, and you suddenly see the beams of an oncoming truck, and that jolts you awake, and the adrenaline surge from being jolted, if you don't hit the truck, is what gets you safely home. I sometimes hope that that's what Trump will be for us. What is the biggest issue in the USA today? That's a hard question. There's so many different ways to answer it. I think we can distinguish between big issues and urgent issues. I mean, the biggest issue is probably climate change and the ability of sustaining human life as we know it in the northern hemisphere of this planet. The most urgent issue, probably drugs and the terrible toll taken by the opioid epidemic. And probably the most intractable issue is how do we share the proceeds of economic growth in a way that is a little bit more equitable and does a lot more to promote social stability. Anything else over there that...
David Humphrey has an interesting one about social media at the top.
What is
it's too long to pass you.
So would you summarize it?
Facebook and Twitter
Mm-hmm.
are both accused of having helped to spread Russian and far-right
Yeah.
propaganda in many ways. Should we abandon them altogether as a form of protest. So should people be using social media?
I don't think we have. Look, I don't think we have any choice about using social media. It's like a lot of corporations do behave in irresponsible ways, and their products are still pretty indispensable. And here we are using. Facebook probably has the worst record, but how do we not use this platform? I think one of the things that these companies do need to feel is that a new kind of regulation is on their way, just as we eventually had to regulate the railroads in the 19th century to prevent some of their extreme abuses. If Facebook got a sense that legislation was on the way that was going to make it more of a publisher and make it, if I defame somebody on this platform right now, the law makes very clear Facebook is not liable. But why should that be so? If I defame somebody in the Atlantic, is we're both liable. Both I and the Atlantic are liable. Why should Facebook be able to escape all liability for how its platform is used? Now, taking that seriously, it would put Facebook out of business, or at least destroy its profitability, because it would have to hire tens of thousands of editors to supervise what is put up on the platform. But even a whiff that something like that was coming might encourage greater corporate responsibility. Instead, we saw this astonishing Twitter tirade of self-absolution from Facebook's vice president of advertising yesterday, in which he completely accepted and lent his credibility and the company's credibility to the Donald Trump theory of what happened with Russia. Do you see any way for the USA to get universal health care? I don't think there's any way to get for any country to get universal health care. What you can get is more universal health coverage. Even Britain, with the National Health Service, it's just not true that everybody gets the same kind of healthcare, even has access to the same kind of healthcare. It's bounded by geography, it's bounded by who you know, it's bounded by all kinds of other considerations. But I think you can imagine ways to make the American system, to make the coverage more universal. One of the things that I think probably the easiest way to imagine getting there is both to make simultaneously to make Medicare less generous and to lower the age limit. The politics of that are extremely difficult. But right now, what happens is once you get 60 to 65, you get this astonishingly generous program, and that's where all of the resources go. If it started a little bit earlier but covered a little bit less, I think that would, people in their 50s are also an at-needs population too. And that would be something of a start. I think also you can imagine, putting, you could imagine that making these state exchanges more generous in such a way as to encourage more and more people to leave the employer-provided system, and to see the state exchanges not as like the last choice that anybody would have, but really as sort of the default and normal choice for those people who are not of Medicare age. What do you think will happen between the United States and North Korea? I worry about this a lot. I have no predictions to offer, except that I really do fear that I fear that we could stumble into a crisis that is much bigger than the Trump people understand or appreciate, and that I don't think anybody can sleep well at night feeling that the ultimate decider here is somebody who is as impulsive and uninformed as President Trump. Many asking for my comment on the president's recent Twitter meltdown. Wasn't that amazing? Every once in a while, I worry that we're losing our capacity to be horrified by the things that Donald Trump does. And then he does something so horrifying that he it's like Disney bringing your childhood back, that Donald Trump brings back your ability to be horrified. Just the idea that the president of the United States, a man whose every word moves markets and decides war and peace, would erupt in this way. And after this terrible tragedy would have not a word of compassion for President Obama, whom I voted against twice. You could see, he never got past Newtown. That was with him every moment for the rest of his life. So many of us have never gotten past it. Donald Trump, it's forgotten already. Have a good time. But clearly when these things are triggered by external events, And one theory, the theory that's on the front page of the New York Times, I think yesterday, is that Donald Trump began by thinking that the Mueller indictment was good news for him. And then it was explained because the indictment very carefully stated that those Americans who had been contacted by the 13 particular Russians in the indictment, those Americans were unwitting, and Donald Trump did not understand that that was not a blanket absolution of all Americans who worked with any Russians. And it was explained to him, and that's what set him off. I think, though, there's also he's got a compounding set of stress of, he's got a chief of staff who he doesn't get along with. And the Rob Porter story, I think, has this haunting back question, because remember the key decisions about retaining Porter in the face of the evidence that he had abused two of his wives, those decisions were made under Reince Priebus, not under General Kelly. Reince Priebus was the weakest, most indecisive, most fearful chief of staff in history. If Reince Priebus said, disregard the images, go ahead, we're keeping Porter, it's very hard to imagine that he didn't clear that with Donald Trump. And so there may be some sort of lingering sense left over from that. He's under a lot of pressure, and obviously he doesn't handle pressure well. But it's a reminder of what more of this is in our future. And it's always worth keeping in mind that these outbursts are being carefully monitored by every foreign intelligence service on Earth that is developing psychographic readings. And those people want to take advantage of the stresses and distractions of the American presidency. They are following this, and they are advantaged by it. Thank you. How do you see the use of money in U.S. politics, and should Citizens United be overturned or constitutional amendment be overtaken? Citizens United is the Supreme Court case that gave corporations the right to spend money making their politics known. It's joined with a DC, people often join it mentally to a DC appellate case that happened, I think, the same year, that allowed for the use of these kinds of anonymous political action committees so that you can retain your anonymity so long as the committee spends half or less of its money on what is deemed by the Federal Elections Commission to be political electioneering. And those are the things that Karl Rove set up that were very influential in 2012 and in 2014 and 15. Thoughts about money. First, the impact of money is greater the lower down the ballot you go. Donald Trump was not the candidate of big money. He was more of a small dollar candidate than any in history. He had, even in the general, half as much money as Hillary Clinton had. Money becomes much more important for Congress, and way more important than that for state races, and way more important than that for state legislatures, and absolutely decisive in races for, say, judges. I would put two things in mind. One is the best way to reduce the impact of money is to reduce the number of offices that are subject to election. I find it shocking that state judges are elected. Maybe that's the Canadian in me. But one reason the federal judiciary is of such higher quality than state judiciaries, not just, and one reason it's so much more prestigious, is because judges are appointed and appointed for life, confirmed by the Senate. If more states followed that rule, and offices like, why are offices like sheriff elected? I mean, those things should be appointed. You should have, if you had fewer elections, you would have less money in politics. But I also think it's very important to keep in mind, and I would say this to liberals who look to overturning these decisions. The whole structure of election finance law that is collapsing around us was only built in the middle 1970s. Before about 1975, there are hardly any rules on money in politics at all. I mean, before 1975, it was legal to give campaign donations in cash. We know almost nothing about how elections before 1976 were financed, and we know literally nothing about how elections were financed before about 1930. So why? So in the days when there were infinite amounts of all cash donations, money nonetheless seemed to count for a lot less. What was different about 1956 than about 1996 or 2006 or 2016? And I think the answer is that back in 1956, most of the things that happened in politics were done by unpaid volunteers, either typically labor unions on the Democratic side, the women of the Protestant churches on the Republican side. You had a society of organizations that did the work of getting people to the polls, registering people to vote, and so on. As we have become a less associational society, money has come in to make up for the absence of those organizations. Much of the Koch brother money is used not to buy advertising, but to do the things that were done by volunteers half a century ago. And if you get money out of politics, I don't know how you get money out of politics unless you find some way to get these activities done without money. Money moved in because other things had already receded. Neil Postman wrote about how mediums ultimately change discourse. Did the rise of cable news and right-wing radio lead to right-wing extremism? I see the circle of conservatism shrinking and only the ranks of so-called rhinos growing. How do conservatives gain any cultural influence when much of their supposed influence, they're basically left them behind? These are the very powerful sequence of questions here, many more than one question here. Mediums do shape discourse. That's clearly true. I mean, historians of the early modern period point out that, absent printing, hard to imagine that there's a Protestant Reformation. Absent radio, hard to imagine how you have a rise of totalitarianism in the 1930s. Cable and AM radio have empowered certain kinds of extremist discourse. I mean, that's how, and you see this even now, even when we know we shouldn't do it. I used to have this joke when I was spending more time at CNN. Well, given that no one's watching CNN from like 11 a.m. to noon or 2 p.m. anyway, why don't you just have bring on really smart people and do a discussion of the financial crisis and take 3 hours, just really go into it. Since nobody's watching anyway, why not have them not watch something good rather than not watch something terrible? But the impulse is always to have more conflict, shorter bursts, more quick takes, more pro wrestling staged arguments, especially in the election cycle of 2016 and the first year of the Trump administration, that you had people on TV. I mean, if most of the people were CNN talking heads sat beside you on the bus and began talking to you, you would literally change your seats rather than listen to them. And yet there they were on a national platform because you had to generate a theater of confrontation in which we had to pretend that somebody like Jeffrey Lord had things to say that were worth hearing. It may be that social media can actually be a way of changing that. One of the things that I was amazed to discover at The Atlantic is that our readers are more and more choosing to read long. And we can actually track it. When you read The Atlantic, we can see how long you spend on any particular article. We can even see how deep you get into the article. And we're discovering our readers like long, which for me is dangerous. I remember telling my editor, Yoni Applebaum, when he pointed this out to me, that to tell me that our readers like long is like telling an alcoholic there's a second bottle of rye whiskey over the refrigerator. Can Congress or the Department of Justice force the removal of White House personnel without permanent security clearances? If not, what might happen with this failure to abide by security law? I don't know the answer to this question, but I venture anything that Congress cannot tell the president who he can share secret information with. And the president, that all of these procedures for granting clearances, I am sure, are pursuant to presidential authority, and I have to assume he has abundant authority to share information with anything. Remember also, the president has the power to declassify anything he wanted to. So the president could take his secret daily intelligence brief, say, "This is declassified now. Here, Jared, you read it." So I don't know. There's a technical fix, but I think it is. I don't know that there's a way to rewrite the presidency around the president. This is one of my great worries in my first article and in the Trumpocracy book. You can't do that. Once you're committed to the presidential system that the United States has, there's no way to make the character, ability, integrity, and patriotism and loyalty of the president to make those dispensable things. There's no way around them. Thank you. Is there any movement toward a third party by moderate Republicans? There's a lot of talk about it. I don't know that. I don't know that's how political change comes. And I mean, I think a lot of the really, and I don't think at this point moderate Republicans are going to be able to bring much of the party along with them unless there's a lot more pain. Some bad defeats in the next 2 or 3 cycles, realizing that the party is stuck. That the party loses a lot of power because of Trump in 2018, loses more in 2020, and that it's still struggling with his image in 2022, that may begin a process of change. I think the most immediately urgent question is to say, do the Democrats veer to their left, Or do they try to become a broad party of the center? One of the questions I saw asked earlier is, can I envision a Trump of the left in the United States? And that's very easy for me to imagine. But you see those. I mean, I think that's what Jeremy Corbyn is in England. I think you have Trumpist parties of the left in Italy. You see the rise of the Russians are giving support both to the Alternative for Germany and the party of the left inside the Federal Republic. I can well imagine that a more charismatic version of a Jill Stein figure, a younger Bernie Sanders who is less off-putting to women and minorities, that somebody like that could generate a lot of energy. There are a lot of people on the political left who are looking for messiah figures. I think, the informal motto, we need to make our politics boring again, may be attractive to middle-aged people with a lot to lose. But the people bring the energy to politics, they want to believe in somebody. And the candidates who ask people to believe in them, I think one of the things we've all learned is just why our parents and grandparents were so suspicious of those people. There's a line of Eugene Victor Debs that I am more and more haunted by. Debs, of course, was the great organizer of American socialism, himself a very charismatic figure. And he famously said to an enthusiastic cheering crowd, "I would not lead you into the promised land if I could, because if I could lead you in, somebody else could lead you out." I think we need more of that wisdom. Reaction to Rick Gates turning into a canary. I think it was Jonathan Chait's joke that Gambino-style roll-up is not a phrase usually attributed to the American presidency. That does look like what is happening here, that Gates is being pressured to flip Manafort, and Manafort is being pressured in a way that he will give up Don Trump Jr. And once you have Donald Trump Jr.'s evidence, then you're able to crack to the very center of whatever it is that is going on inside the Trump White House. I think one of the things I am struck by in the indictment, the indictment of the 13, not the Gates indictment, is the degree of information from the FBI and the NSA that Mueller was willing to make public. One of the ways that espionage activities are usually protected is because even when the government knows about them, it doesn't want to make an indictment because then it would reveal what it knows and how it knows it. I think Mueller's making the decision, it is more important to get to the bottom of this case than to protect every last secret of the United States. That's a very bold decision. I think it's right because technology always evolves. The Russians will have new ways of keeping things secret, and the United States will need new ways of cracking them. But meanwhile, right now, we are facing a possible contaminated president in the Oval Office. It's really urgent to get to the bottom of that. Vanna, anything else?
There was a second question on that.
Okay, let me take this one. Please address your point that if we don't elect Republicans, they will abandon democracy. Hasn't that in some essential way already happened? Okay, this is referring to a line in my book that I have then made an Atlantic video about, warning about what happens if conservatives become pessimistic. Look, this is not a hostage taking. I'm not saying nice democracy you have here, you'd better vote Republican or else they'll mess it up. I'm making a completely observational point, very much inspired. I think a lot of people have seen the Ziblatt and Levitsky book, How Democracies Die. It's an excellent book. I also recommend, although it is much more difficult reading, Daniel Ziblatt's first book called Conservative Parties and the Rise of Democracy. I think I have that right, where he talks about how one of the things that most predicted whether a European country in the 19th century would get on a sustainable path of development in the way that Britain and Sweden did, and the Netherlands to a lesser extent, or whether it would have a bumpier road to democracy like Germany and Italy, was whether the local Conservative Party early on made a decision, hey, we can compete democratically. There's no need to give up on legality and liberalism and parliamentarianism. Where conservatives became pessimistic, as in Germany and Italy, that did happen. Where conservatives remained optimistic they could compete, England, Sweden, the Netherlands, they had a more continuous road to democracy. I think that is a true point. I think you can see that happening in the United States, that in a lot of the states, North Carolina, Wisconsin, that Republicans are responding to their increasing pessimism, not by altering their policies to be more competitive, but by changing the rules of the game so their opponents can't vote. Not all of their opponents, they're not abolishing elections. That's the way things were done in the 1930s. It's super inefficient. I mean, you abolish elections and you get reaction. If you can just find some way to knock out the 4 or 6 or 8 points of the population you're most worried about, disqualify them from voting in some way, you can all get all the benefits of de-democratizing without any of the, or without so much of the odium. So I worry about that. Now, my answer is not, therefore, you, Mr. Voter, Madame Voter, must vote Republican or else. What I'm trying to warn conservatives of, if they remain committed to intractable and unelectable politics, they are, without fully understanding what they're doing, committing themselves to a path that leads them away from democracy. Someone asked, in what area of the country does the best wine come from? Okay, that's obviously from either this from the wrong dialogue, or somebody thinks I'm a much bigger alcoholic than I really am. Please share with us a personal Hitchens story. This is a story I tell in my answer to that book that claimed that Christopher walked up to a deathbed, Christian conversion, and then walked away from it because he was too afraid. I got into sort of a back and forth with the author of that piece, and you can read the whole piece on the Atlantic website. And he said, you're no doubt going to tell some story to illustrate, your close connection to Christopher Hitchens. And so I said, okay, challenge accepted. But the point of this is not that I was so close to him. He had many closer friends than me. But as an illustration of the kind of person he was, he and I had done an event together at Holy Blossom Synagogue in Toronto. This must have been about 2005. And afterwards, he was staying at a hotel a few miles away. For those of you who know Toronto, it was the Park Hyatt, then Park Plaza Hotel. And we sat down, and my wife Danielle was with us. She ordered a bottle of wine. And we became aware that there was someone who was a woman in the corner staring at Christopher. And we sort of figured out that we had seen her at the synagogue, and that she had followed him or anticipated that he was staying here, and had hunted him down all the way to this hotel bar in order to corner him. And he looked desperate and hunted because he could never cope. And she sort of made a beeline toward him and began asking him questions. And Danielle elbowed me, and I stood up and walked over to her and said, Christopher's answered all the questions he's going to answer today. His working day is over, and thank you very much. And I sort of escorted her out of the bar. And I sat down with him, and he said, very gratefully, I can never do that. He was not able to stop answering questions. And he was somebody who, he had this generosity of spirit. If people wanted to talk to them, he would stand on a street corner in the rain and answer their questions as long as they kept asking them. And he didn't have that kind of self-protective filter, that zone of privacy that he needed to develop in order to cope with the degree of fame that came to him in his last years. Crown Royal or Canadian Club? Oh, come on. If GOP can't win, will it destroy? Look, I think California offers a vision of what the future could be, that you have a Republican Party that surrendered becoming competitive and has instead veered off into ever greater extremes. And you have a Democratic Party that then becomes the dominant party and becomes ever more factionalized. And instead of having party politics, which tend to be, to a great extent, not entirely about issues, you get factional politics, which are entirely about personalities and ethnicities and localities, and they become a division of the spoils. And that makes for some very bad government. So I think if you don't have an effective party system, you get bad politics in the United States because of the Electoral College, because of the history and practices of the country. That a party system must be a two-party system for a long time to come anyway. I can't imagine anything else. If you don't have that, you will get a very dangerous and less successful kind of politics. Let's see here if why don't Americans ever step back from conversations like we should arm teachers and say, wait a minute, how do we even reach a point where a discussion like this happens? I think one of the things that is a factor in the gun discussion is people aren't very realistic about their own limits. I mean, how many people do you know who admit they aren't very good at driving? How many people are aware their jokes aren't that funny? People think and there are a lot of people who have this vision of themselves in the climactic moment, saving the day with the well-placed shot, gets the malefactor right between the eyes, saving the classroom. And the idea that, as anybody, whoever drilled soldiers on a firing range can tell us that guns in people's hands are a formula for mayhem. Almost nobody shoots well, and even fewer shoot well in the terror of an uncertain situation. I think that there is a lot of Walter Mittyism at work, a lot of people's heroic fantasies. What do you say about various hack historians that sell out to right-wing publications? I won't name names, but you know what I mean, who try to tie things like Lincoln and Rome to the modern Republican Party. I think generally, look, there are some right-wing abuses here where, we will name the Dinesh D'Souza approach to history and others, where they try to make the point that since Jefferson Davis was a member of the Democratic Party, that therefore modern Democrats are Jefferson Davis. And they also try to take the credit of figures like Abraham Lincoln for modern politicians who don't share his views at all. But I think there's just a larger problem, which is an attempt to use history to draw analogies. That yes, it can be done in bad faith, but it's not very helpful even when done in good faith. And the Roman examples are particularly, that's just done by people not taking history seriously as a thing in itself. There are things to learn about the past, but you really have to understand the past. A saying I quote a lot comes from a history professor of mine, Roberto Lopez, a great medievalist. He used to say, history never repeats itself. It only appears to do so to those who do not pay attention to the details. What else? I go back here. Why has the right been so much more effective at creating a mainstream activist media bubble than the left? That's a really important question. I think the answer is that the potential audience for right-wing politics is not only larger than the potential active base for left-wing politics, serious left-wing politics, but also more united. That is, that there's probably, maybe a fifth of the country that is ready for authoritarian, white nationalist, gun first politics. Maybe a fifth, maybe a little less. And that's a pretty big bunch of people, and that they can sustain a Fox News. Meanwhile, the left is not only smaller, but it's also much more internally divided. That's one of the things that you saw in 2016. Bernie Sanders' electorate was very nearly as white as Donald Trump's is. So the non-white left, which has got its kind of concerns, and the white left are going to have a lot of points of difference, different kinds of issues, different kinds of history, different kinds of heroes. I think also it is true that minority politics, and especially black politics, has been much more, to use an old-fashioned term, regular than white politics of the left. Much more respectful of authority structures, much more attuned to the machinery of government, much more practical in its goals. There was this tension in 2016. You saw this between the Bernie Sanders people who talked about having some kind of unspecified revolution that would affect procedural issues like campaign finance, and Hillary Clinton's ability to reach out to minority groups who are very left-wing often, but who are very focused on things like delivery of government services and the preservation of government jobs. So I think that's the core of it. That Bernie Sanders people and the Bernie Sanders movement was very ethnically specific and very small. I can't do that. How do you feel about Rich Lowry's point of view that you need to make schools have increased security and metal detectors? I'm just amazed by how heavily we're prepared to burden potential gun victims, and all the things we're not prepared to ask of potential gun owners. Why not a vision test? Right? You want to buy a gun, you have to prove that you can actually see more than 10 feet away from your body. That would seem like a pretty basic requirement. And then I'm not even asking for skill, just you can see the target. No one requires you to do that. But we're prepared to make every child in America go through a system as if they were boarding an airplane before going to school. I think rights come with responsibilities. You register to vote. You're also put on the roll for the jury, that you have to accept jury service or the potential for jury service as a duty that comes with your exercising your right to vote. You want to exercise your right of free speech. You have to accept that that comes with responsibilities. That you cannot defame people, and that you are maybe subject to criticism for what you say. But with guns, we don't have any of those responsibilities. I think in general, I mean, it's pretty easy for me to imagine a world in which, you want a rifle or a shotgun that's really easy to get, subject to some very basic requirements. Handguns are more difficult. If you want a weapon like an AR-15, you need to offer a pretty good reason why you should have it. One of the things that the Canadians do that I think makes a lot of sense is when you apply for a gun license, the police interview with the gun applicant not present, not only the present, but the past 2 years worth of intimate partners, just to make sure you're not going to use it to shoot, a former lover, which is probably one of the most frequent abuses of weapons, much more frequent than school shootings. It's 12:56. I have time for one more question. Any final thoughts on the mooch? You live long enough and all kinds of things you never expected to happen to you. And to be the subject of a TMZ rant, I never thought that would happen. And thanks to the mooch, I now understand how TMZ works, which I did not know before. I actually was naive enough to imagine that there are actually paparazzi standing in front of restaurants where Lindsay Lohan happened to be, and they happened to catch her thoughts on Paris Hilton. And I now learned that's not the way that actually is Lindsay Lohan's publicist who calls up and says, if you stand in front of this place, Lindsay will have some thoughts on Paris Hilton. And so it was with the mooch that he called in TMZ and unburdened himself. And so not only was that a new experience, but I also learned something about a part of American culture that I just didn't know enough about before. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a relaxing President's Day for those of you who have the day off work. I hope you have a productive rest of afternoon for those of you who don't. Thanks for viewing. I'm so grateful for your questions. Bye-bye.